Hello, everyone. Welcome to meeting of the Task Force to Reimagine Policing in Brookline. This is our meeting for Friday, November 6th, 2020. I'm Raul Fernandez, Select Board Member and Chair of the Task Force, joined here by our able Task Force members and town staff. Just wanted to start by noting that yes, we are still awaiting the final votes to be tallied in the presidential election. And we may not know for some time what the final result is, or we could potentially know today. So we are in a position in a state of uncertainty, and that is just simply how we're operating right now. It seems to be the theme for 2020 is operating in a state of uncertainty. What we do know is certain is that that we've got work to do, and that the work that we're doing actually is within our local control, by and large. We have the opportunity here to engage our community in envisioning and reimagining what public safety might look like here in Brookline. And so we're going to go ahead and keep doing that and go about our work, and hopefully that work will eventually be supported, not just at the local level, but also at the state and national level. So let's get into it. We have an agenda that folks can find online, but I'll walk us all through it. We're going to do briefly any updates members of the task force have. Then we're going to approve the meeting minutes from October 30th. Almas will help lead us in a discussion on police department database software. Nothing wake you up in the morning like a discussion about database software. And then we're going to get into our subcommittee updates and one more update on the policing survey before providing opportunity for any new business. And folks that have been following our work closely know that a lot of the sort of day-to-day of what we're doing has been shifted to the subcommittee level. So I do encourage folks to go onto the Brookline calendar to sign up. If you sign up for alerts for the entire task force, you will get alerted every time a subcommittee meeting is scheduled also. So if you have an interest in vulnerable people and people in crisis, or the issues that we're looking into related to school resource officers or walk and talk officers, or the departmental analysis, or that big community engagement piece, I really encourage anyone who's watching to sign up for those alerts so that you can actually join our subcommittee meetings and see where the heart of the work is really being done at this stage in our progress. With that said, if you tune into these meetings, you're going to get those sort of more top level updates, what we'll talk about today, and as we sort of report out as subcommittee groups provide updates, but also get feedback from members of the task force. And we always welcome your feedback too. So please, write me directly, rfernandez@brooklinema.gov with your feedback. And also we are, I hope we get to talk about this today, going to provide more opportunities for the public to give us direct feedback in venues like this and other ways. So we'll hear more about that soon. All right, so let's get started. We've got some time set aside if there are any folks that have any updates that they'd like to provide before we get into things. Okay. Well, let's get right into it. The first thing I have on our agenda is the question of approving the meeting minutes from Friday, October 30th, 2020. Does anyone have any edits that were not already sent over to Devin? No. All right, so what we'll do is, once again, everybody unmute, that'd be great. It'll make it faster. And I'll go one by one and ask you if you'd like to vote yes, no, or abstain. Aye, nay, abstain, however you want to do it. Anne?
Yes.
Almas?
Yes.
Bonnie?
Yes.
Malcolm?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Eitan?
Yes.
Alexander?
Yes.
Chi-Chi?
Yes.
Kristen?
Yes.
And Kimberly?
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. Okay, great. Moving on to our next order of business. We have this discussion on police department database software. This is a discussion of the police department's database software as a potentially rich source of information for both the Reform Committee and the Reimagining Task Force. Almas, please take it away.
So I believe everyone has that in their packet that was sent out by Devin. So you would open up, I think it was called, I forget the name of the title of the thing in the packet, something to do with data. And if you open that up and look at it, but I'd also like to, since it was Ronald Wilkinson from the Police Reform Committee that did this, I was wondering whether it would be possible for him to be a panelist and sort of walk us through this document, since he actually did and I believe he is a participant. So is that something we can do?
I think that'd be fine. Devin can, oh, there you go. Talking permitted. There we go. Ronald, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Good to see you.
Yep, you too.
All right.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Is that enabled, Devin?
You're all set.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. So, first of all, to give a little bit of background here from things that I heard, particularly Chief O'Leary say, there are two sources of data out there that might be of use. One is the police department database in particular that is largely maintained in the dispatch center. And the other having to do with information about non-emergency calls is in the Brookline town database, and they're two different databases. So I arranged an interview with both the Brookline Police IT chief and the Brookline Town IT chief to talk about what they've got in the respective databases. It turned out that virtually all of the information that I think we would really be interested in is in the police database. The police database is by a vendor called Larimar Software that's outside of St. Louis, and apparently provides database software for many police departments throughout the country, and they are pioneers in that field. And Brookline has implemented several standard modules of their software, and also has some custom modules for their software. So just to kind of give you that particular background. So the kinds of things that are in that database, you can see on my screen. There's an incident reporting system where officers can kind of explain particular items that come in. One of the key ones is this computer.
Yeah. Before you go on, if I could just let you know that at least on my screen, it appears to be like a little bit smaller than I'd like to see it. I'm seeing.
Yes, I can definitely.
Maybe zoom in or stretch that window out a little bit. That'd be great.
I can do both those things. Whoops. That's
great. Oh, that's much better.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Whoops.
Go for it. Oh.
Yeah, there it goes.
I think you had it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a computer-aided dispatch systems. Whenever either a 911 call comes in or a non-emergency call comes in, that information about the call is entered by the dispatcher into the computer-aided dispatch system. That's number two. The field interview system has to do with particular incidents that happen out in the field. If an officer stops to talk to a civilian or whatever out in the field, they can put the details of that in the field interview system. There are specialized case management systems oriented to particular purposes. The detective case management system is pretty much what you would expect, having to do with investigating crime reports and following up on cases. The community service division has to do with non-traditional policing. That can be anything from school resource officers to working with the elderly, those kinds of those kinds of things, working with juveniles. The crisis intervention cases are pretty much what you would expect. It's specialized information about the work of the crisis intervention team. And then there are traffic-related cases, which would have a lot of good information about traffic stops and that kind of a thing. Then, addition to that, there are some things that you might consider mundane but may be relevant. So for how officers are scheduled for their work shifts, the kind of training that officers have had, their annual in-service training, their crisis intervention training, anti-bias training, all of that is recorded in there, which officers have had it and the last time that they had it. There's tracking of department and property, like radios, weapons, those kinds of things. There's a specialized evidence tracking system. So whenever evidence is taken, it's supposed to be recorded and where it is and what it is, that kind of thing. This is an important one. Internal affairs complaint tracking. Whenever someone files a complaint to the police department, that information is recorded in this internal affairs tracking system. So that should be interesting. Of course, it'll be the police department's point of view, but it will still be a record of everything that the police department has about it. Then there are more detailed traffic records having to do with towed vehicles, parking tickets, and taxi cabs. And then there are some specialized record systems having to do with lodging house inspections, liquor laws, and apparently we have a special thing about false burglar alarm recording and billing. So there's that. And then another thing I find interesting is the National Incident Reporting System. Some information on things like violent crimes and when officers use their weapons are supposed to be uploaded to a national reporting system. I understand that nationally that's not done very consistently, but apparently Brookline has tried to do that, and they have a module in their database that's oriented just towards collecting that data and uploading it to the national system. Those are the different modules. I also wanted to mention that the core software has been in use in Brookline since 1989, so we'll have some data that goes back that far. They've been adding to the core modules since then, so the newer modules will not have data going back that far, but still, some core modules like the computer-aided dispatch, that should go back that far. Also, there are other considerations in there. Then there was upgraded, so there are more features over time, that kind of a thing. So then, given that that is a rich store of data, the question is, how do we tap into it? So, and there will be privacy considerations, legal considerations, all kinds of things like that, security about who has access to it at all. So questions for us to consider and for us to ask the town legal team. So I expect that aggregate statistics that don't identify individuals will not be a problem for us to get, but delving in individual cases will. And I want to go into some more of the geeky details about how easy it is to analyze data that's a nice to sweet feels like numbers versus things that are narrative. Narrative reports are much harder to analyze. So that's just another consideration about when we get around to analyzing the data. Oh, also the voice records of phone calls are not in the database I've talked about so far. It turns out that if a call goes from the phone system, goes through either the front desk or goes into the police department front desk or into the dispatch center, and those can be 911 calls or non-911 calls, as long as they go into the dispatch center. While they are in the dispatch center line or the front desk line, they are recorded. But if they're transferred to another line, like mental health center or something like that, or even another line within the police department that's not one of those two, then the recording does not occur. Also, of those voice recordings, they are retained for a minimum of 1 year. If they are flagged for something like evidence in a case or something like that, they can be retained longer. But those are recorded in a separate database, just as voice records. And we have to decide whether it's even worth tapping them. And if we were going to tap them, we probably would want to get transcripts, and in addition to perhaps the voice records themselves. So that's what we've got to work with. Also, I presented this information at the Reform Committee meeting on Wednesday. People were very receptive, and also in particular, Sergeant Hatchett of the police department over time had worked a lot with that database, and so she has volunteered to work with me on the best way to pull the records out of the database. Yeah, apparently it can be complex to navigate, which is no surprise because there's a lot of it there. So I'm going to have an initial meeting with her to talk about ways of navigating that database and options for getting data out of it. And I'll be happy to report back to both committees about where we are on that. And I want to hear from both committees about what they'd like to look at first. I would imagine particular subcommittees will be interested. For example, the community engagement and the crisis intervention information, I expect will be very, very, very interesting to certain subcommittees. And also, obviously, the complaints will be very interesting to various subcommittees. We can also get information about numbers of traffic stops, that kind of a thing. I'm not sure at this particular point. Well, actually, I believe there's even a separate traffic stop database that goes into things like the race and gender of people at traffic stops. I haven't interviewed anybody about that, but the Police Commissioner O'Leary mentioned that at the Reform Committee meeting on Wednesday, so I can follow up with him more about that particular database. And then there's the notion of combining data from these different databases, which is a non-trivial thing to do, but it's something that I do professionally. So I would be interested in doing that if that turns out to be appropriate for some things we want to do. So that's what I have to say so far. Any questions?
Ron, that's great. I appreciate your work on this. If you can maybe stop sharing so we can see the full task force, and then
Okay.
we can take some questions. And what I'll encourage folks to do is to try to stay grounded in our work. I know there's probably a lot of different directions we can go and questions we might have about data, but I think Ron's essential question to us, as I read it in the document, is do we think that access to the voice recordings, for instance, would be useful to pursue the information, or that the information in the CAD and other public safety modules will be sufficient to meet our needs? Essentially thinking about what kind of information, based on where you are in your subcommittees right now and the work that we've done, do you think you'll need access to this information? So let's go for it. I see Malcolm.
Hey, thanks for this, Ronald. It's really enlightening. I have two really clarifying questions. The first one, when you were talking about your thoughts, and you said something along the line, it's hard for me without the document, should be recorded back to 1989. I'm curious about that should. Is that something you're suggesting, or are you saying like
no,
we should have access?
There is definitely data going back to 1989.
Okay.
It won't be all of the data because they've added things as they've gone along. But
Okay.
the core of the data, goes back to 1989.
Excellent, thank you. And the other one is field interviews. Did you know? I know we keep data on them, but are those optional entries? So in other words, like is it up to the police officer that is out and about to then enter those field interviews, or is there something? Is there a criteria to them?
I would imagine that there is criteria that would be in policy, and I don't know what those policies are at this particular point.
Okay, thank you.
Malcolm, I could address that. There is a policy in effect. We made the change in how we record field interrogation stops around 2015 or 16. Each officer that wants to submit a person's identifying information has to write a report with it. It goes to a designated supervisor. One supervisor checks over all of them and decides whether they meet the standard of reasonable suspicion, which is was, or about to commit a crime. If they meet this minimum standard that's set by law, then we'll put that information into the field interrogation system. So there is a process to it. and it requires supervisory review before it even gets entered. Prior to that, I'll be honest with you, the field interrogation system was kind of like a holding area for a lot of names, not necessarily related to crimes. We did it for, say, loud parties, when your fines to the people running loud parties increased on the amount of times that we respond and things like that. We cleared it up, and like I said, I think it's around 2016. And we
does it require knowing a person's identification?
Pardon me?
So in other words, if a police officer were to stop me and I was walking home and they started asking me questions, but never asked me for ID, would that be something that would go into data? Like that would be recorded?
Depending on the circumstances, yes. It would go in if they thought it was suspicion. It would go in with a report as to why you got stopped, what was the nature of it. I can't believe that they would submit something without asking for ID, and then that goes to a supervisor who has to review it.
Well, I think that's why I'm asking, because frankly, from a lot of my students, as well as my personal experience, which is before 2015, I wouldn't necessarily be asked for data, but I'd be asked a slew of questions. And so if they didn't have my name, they wouldn't enter it. And so that's why I'm asking.
I would say if they didn't ask you for your identification, or they didn't ask people for identification, they would not submit it to be entered.
Okay.
I'll just say, Chief, I think that may, for some of us, be a revelation. When we look at the FI data, one of the things that at least I was thinking about it was that these are all of the field interrogations that have taken place in Brookline. I just want to make sure I get this right. Are we saying that there may be others that where there are stops and questions asked of folks, but that does not get logged if the officer doesn't feel like it warrants being logged? Is that the case?
Depending on the reason for the stop, yes. It could be the case you just ask somebody on the street for something and there's nothing to it. I would say that they didn't ask for your name and they didn't conduct a formal stop, they wouldn't submit it to go in.
Yeah. Well, there must have been a reason why they stopped them in the first place.
Yes, there has to be a reason as to why they got stopped in the first place.
I'm just trying to figure out what falls in the category of nothing showing or nothing there, but someone was stopped and asked questions by a police officer.
Well, they would have to have a suspicion that they were involved in some type of criminal activity.
Right.
Just think about the sort of, I'll take a stereotype of somebody calling up and saying there's somebody in the neighborhood who who looks suspicious, looking in a house or something of that sort, and call a police officer responds to that. There would be potentially, presumably, a field interrogation, but if the person was doing something that was perfectly innocent, that wouldn't pass the test of being related to potential crime. It wouldn't go into the system. Is that fair?
On the other hand, it would go into the computer-aided dispatch system because someone calls and an officer was dispatched. So at least that information would be there.
Right.
So
but if the officer says that there's nothing suspicious about the person, it wouldn't be submitted into the field interrogation system.
Okay. So one of the questions that Ronald asked was, or one of the things he said was, you could combine data from different pieces of this, matching one. And one of the questions we had was, well, how often is there how often is something going on, whether it's a traffic stop or some other kind of interaction between a citizen and a police officer, a civilian and a police officer? Is one of the questions that we had was, well, how frequently is something related to a potential crime or an outstanding warrant or something of that sort? And I'm wondering whether we could fine tune our questions a little bit to be able to extract that data partly out of the calls that come in, the large number of calls that come in, and compare that to the number of calls in field interrogation system. Just get a sense of percentages.
I think I know that we give that information out every year, and I think last year there was about 40-something people stopped and that got entered into the field interrogation system.
Yep.
So I would think that if you wanted to backtrack from that system as to what the officer thought they were involved in, that could be done.
Okay.
Yeah, this is an area, I'll just say, you know, when you look at the annual report, that context really isn't there. I mean, one might read the annual report and say only 46 people were stopped by Brookline police officers and asked questions based on whatever factors, whatever reason the officer had, whether it was because they received a call or they saw what they thought was suspicious behavior or whatever it was. It's not altogether clear when you read that report that there are others who are, it's not clear at all that there are others who have been stopped that don't end up in those data. And I don't know where those numbers are captured. It seems nowhere. And that I mean, first of all, the lack of context there is striking, but also, you know, I think this is something we need to look into, you know, in terms of policy change, whether or not we want to make sure that all of those interactions are recorded so that, you know, that we have the full picture of what stops look like in town.
Well, I think the flip side to that is, are you violating, as the police officers, violating someone's rights in order to accomplish that? If the police are, we're not dealing with a perfect science. We're dealing with people that are given descriptions or people that are telling you something, and the officer conducts an investigation. I think that's something people would want. I think if we require the officers just to act on a phone call and not do any backup checking on their own, I think that's the wrong way to go about business, because you do get people that call up and say there's a suspicious person standing on the corner. Okay, so the officer shows up and it's an African-American male. Under the scenario you said, that if they're going to stop them, they got to put all the information out, then they got to go up and stop them. And then they got to take the information. And why are we holding that information? The information of putting this guy into a database isn't fair to that guy because he wasn't doing anything. So there's a balance that you got to look at.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting that at all, actually. What I was suggesting is that information be captured in some way. There was a stop that took place at this day and time at this location. It was baseless based on the conversation. And by the way, it was, as far as we can tell, an African-American male. I think that would be sufficient. I don't know that we need, I agree that I don't think we need to ask someone for their name and info and ask for their license and things like that. But that's something that we should probably look into. I don't think we're going to solve it right here.
Right, but there is a fine line there. That's all.
I agree with you. So we've got a list of people waiting to ask questions about this and other topics. So let's get into it. I see Bonnie.
Hey, I'm really curious about this non-emergency calls database. I would love to know what's in there.
Okay, so my understanding is that there were phone logs. Well, first of all, there are two things. One, there are phone logs for the non-emergency calls. The phone logs are actually in the town's database. However, if they're routed to the information about the non-emergency calls will be typed into the computer-aided dispatch system. There's that. That's number one. But when it goes into the computer-aided dispatch system, it will be flagged as being a non-emergency call, and information about the reason for the call, as I understand it, will be there. I think that I've got that accurately. But Chief O'Leary, does that sound accurate to you the way I've described it?
Yes, the kind of calls that you're going to get on non-emergency that are in the town system is only going to be the numbers of calls, and they're only going to be for 2 30-day periods, and that's it. The recordings of the calls are in the police department, maintained by the police department as required by law, and maintained for about a year, for at least a year.
Okay. I think it's worth saying that, I'll say in principle, although the town is in the town's database, the information is recorded for going back over 2 months. In principle, one could extract that information and keep it for longer in a separate area if that were appropriate. That implies some resources and database extraction, but that's commonly done in situations where you've got an operational system that only records data, relatively current data, but you want to keep it historically for whatever reason. So in principle, that could be done. It would take some resources to set that up, but in principle, that could be done. But that's not what we're doing now, which is what we're talking about.
So what I think that some of that information might be very useful. Is there a route to look at that? That sounded, what you just said is very confusing.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm not a data person.
No, that's okay. I'm not sure I said it clearly. What Chief Hillary said, just logs of numbers of calls, just kind of statistics, numbers of calls that are made to non-emergency lines are in the town's database. They keep that information for no more than 2 months. If we had, and I think they do reports too, so you can look at hard copy reports based on that data. That would obviously just kind of be there. But
reports.
if for some, pardon me, just count that are just kind of counts of non-emergency calls. That
okay.
Yeah, okay. But if for some reason we wanted to keep those counts for longer than 2 months, like say extract them and put them in I'll just kind of wave my hands a little bit and say Excel files or whatever, and just kind of keep them in another database, I'll say kind of our own for longer than that so that we can see trends over time. That could be done in principle.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so, because we were thinking a lot about where those calls come from, how often they come in, who are the ones that are utilizing that number.
Okay, so that gets interesting because correct me if I'm wrong, Chief O'Leary. I would expect that the town database might say what the phone number is that made the call, but it wouldn't have information per se on details about who made the call. If you wanted to know more information about who made the call and what the call was about, when that call is routed into the dispatch center, they would record in the computer-aided dispatch system that this call came in, it was not an emergency call, and this is what the call was about, and that's going to be there forever, as I understand it.
If I could just clarify for a minute there, not everything that's called into the station is put into the CAD. It could be just a call to talk about a traffic ticket, and that just would get forwarded over to the traffic division.
Oh, okay.
So out of the database, it's just calls, just the numbers of calls, and that's run by the town. It's the town's telephone system. And I know we're using the term non-emergency, but some emergency calls do come over that line, and calls that get recorded as service calls, those go into CAD. Anything else could be transferred anywhere in the police department, or it could be just giving them some outside referral. And not necessarily identified.
Okay, so if the calls come into the police department and they are transferred to a different line, in the town database, can you tell what line they were transferred to?
That I don't know. I think Fung would have to answer that for us. I don't know that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thing that he mentions is the town IT director. Okay, so that's a follow-up question.
Thank you.
Ron, and I've got some other folks here. Just something that's on my mind, and I'd be very curious to see as you continue in this work, what your recommendations become for how long the data is kept. Certainly, I think we've talked about this before. The 2 months is not long enough to really understand trends that are happening over time. And at the same time, I don't know if there are certain prohibitive factors in keeping data in perpetuity. For instance, if we thought it was a good idea to retain the actual recordings of phone calls, I don't know, if that's something that the technology and also in terms of storage, we have the capacity to do, and whether or not it even makes sense to keep that information in perpetuity. But those are things that I hope you'll dig into more.
Yeah, there would be. I would expect both technology and legal considerations that would come into play there.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, Kristen.
Thank you. Ron, I really appreciate you bringing this to the subcommittee, to the full task force. I'm curious to know what is the structure or the implications for the specialized community division cases. I'm curious if you can say a bit more about either what data is in there that's separate from the other subsystems, and what the opportunities may be for us to learn as a member of the community engagement subcommittee, what opportunities there may be for us to learn more about.
Okay, so first of all, I only touched on I only discussed that briefly, but in what was mentioned specifically were things like juvenile cases, working with the elderly, and I believe there were some other sort of like general housing cases, and I don't remember what other things were in there specifically. Although that's another one of those things that I expect to get more detail on as I work with Sergeant Hatchett on. But it does have to do with sort of non-traditional policing kinds of things.
Kristen, a lot of it on those systems are specialized tracking case management systems. I know that you mentioned that Ron mentioned a couple. Another thing would be, say, a graffiti call. The graffiti investigator is Tim Stevenson, that comes in under community service. That's where he works. If they get graffiti on a building, there's a town bylaw that has to be complied with. So that information would go in there as far as the investigation on the incident of graffiti itself. That would allow any officer to go in and look if they get a call when Tim Stevenson is not around, and they can check what's going on about that. The thing with the traffic thing, I know that might be a question that comes up. We get a lot of complaints in neighborhoods over speeding cars or red light violations or things like that. We track what an officer does to try to eliminate that problem, and that gets tracked in those systems. So they're unique to detectives, community service, traffic, and CIT. It's basically a more formalized way to manage your cases.
Can you, Chief, can you just expand upon it a little bit more? So are you saying you use the existing data as to give you an indication around officer performance, and then to sort of retrain? Are you using any of these data in those ways?
Well, there are certain steps that an officer has to take on an investigation, whether it's in any one of those four things there. And there's a case review that's done by the supervisors, should be done on a pretty consistent basis to make sure that these cases are followed up and nothing's fallen through the cracks. So if somebody is not doing it the right way, yeah, that could be a training thing. It could be that the person can't work there anymore at the same time and gets moved out. So it's used to resolve the issue that is there, or make sure that the case is investigated properly and the proper steps are taken. But there are some other things that system can do for the department.
Let's say, so Kristen, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I don't come away with the wrong understanding. So is it as a matter of course that anything related to juveniles would be in the community services portion, or that some cases, for example, related to juveniles would be in the community services portion?
Some would be in there, some could be the detective division, some could be in the CIT. It just depends on who's looking and when, and what the nature of what the nature of it is. It's tough to say that everyone fits in a box, so I don't think they do. And I think that the same person that you had some CIT incidents with that in his or her household then could be investigated for a crime a little bit later. So there could be overlap, yes.
Okay, my understanding is that the software modules are, I'll say, sufficiently integrated that you could probably trace an individual through those different modules.
You could, there's a name system in there too. You could run the name, and the name would come up as to the times that the person has been interacted with and where that information is. So it can be tracked.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Alexander.
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions about the field interview piece here. I was really surprised, Chief O'Leary, by some of the things you said, and I'm hopeful that you can sort this out for me. So what I'm hearing here is that whether, and maybe you can distinguish this from Boston's FIO system, field interrogation and observation, because it sounds pretty similar in the types of stops that we're talking about and whether they get recorded. So what I'm hearing here is that it's ultimately fairly discretionary whether the officer logs this stop into the system, and that it's then reviewed by a supervisor prior to getting logged into the system, which to me in some ways seems like two different levels of discretion that could be a possible pause point before something gets logged. So what is the exact standard here? Is it when the stop itself was based on reasonable suspicion? Is it when the officer thinks that criminal activity for this individual will continue beyond the context of the stop? Or is this an actual method for recording, reasonable suspicion Terry stops?
Reasonable suspicion Terry stops.
Okay. So there were only 46 reasonable suspicion Terry stops in all of Brookline last year?
Yes, something like that, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm not saying, I can't come out and say that's all the stops, but that's the Terry stops. I think, and I tried to say it earlier, once you get, and the officer gets in his mind that this is not a suspicious stop, this person is not the one that we're looking for, there is absolutely no reason to hold that person and put that person out, and that person gets let go. Those are probably not recorded. Officer probably didn't even ask him his name or her name. But at that point, we have no reason to do it. I think at that point, you're violating the person's rights, and they're told we got to let them go.
So just a quick follow-up question there. So what I'm hearing here is that when there is a reasonable suspicion Terry stop, where the officer turns out to have been incorrect, that the person was not connected to a crime, that stop is not recorded?
Well, I didn't say that was a Terry stop.
Okay, no, sure.
I mean, the officers can go up and talk to anybody that they want.
Yeah.
And
but we're talking about reasonable suspicion, right? So
if they didn't have reasonable suspicion to stop that guy to begin with, then
right.
If they had reasonable suspicion and they confirmed it, that goes into the database. If they thought they had reasonable suspicion, but it's not the guy, then they're not going to ask him his name, and they're not going to record that in the database.
Right. So if the officer thinks they have reasonable suspicion, right, in order to initiate the stop, and turns out to be incorrect, then they don't record that into the database.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's Chief. I think that's the thing that we need to look into, because there's, we don't know if above and beyond the 46 stops that have been captured, for instance, in the previous year, if there were 5 additional stops or 50 additional stops or 500 additional stops. I doubt it's that many, but we just don't know because that information doesn't seem to be captured anywhere. And that seems to be a hole in our data collection in some way. But I fully agree that in those cases there is no reason to ask someone for their identification and all that kind of stuff. But some way to capture the fact that a stop was made would be helpful. Yeah. Okay. Next up, I see Anne.
Hi, I think Alexander mostly just asked the question I was going to ask, but just to wrap my head around this, if a, say, 16-year-old Black male is walking home from the high school at 5 o'clock, which is now dark, and a police officer is driving by and rolls down the window and asks where the person is going or where the person has come from, does that does not get recorded, correct?
First of all, I don't know why an officer would be asking questions like that, but no.
Well,
I would say
I've
that- I would
heard
say that-
anecdotally that that's happened a number of times, so that's why I'm asking.
Well, I would say that no, they probably would not be recorded.
Okay, thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, I think we're asking a lot of questions about the detail of the way things work and so forth. And while I absolutely agree that it's important to understand that, I think it'd be very useful to spend some time taking a look at the major areas of interest that we have and seeing what data is available to us right now, or what data could be available to us by combining data from two different databases, combining fields from two different databases, and seeing how that data can enlighten us on the main topics that we have. So yesterday, we were talking about traffic stops, for example. And one question that I asked was, how often does a traffic stop turn into a situation in which a police officer discovers that there's an outstanding warrant or some other issue with an unregistered vehicle, or whatever, with the driver? And if we can extract that kind of data, maybe we could spend some time making offline, making a list in our minds about what data we'd like to extract, and then get back and see what is available. We could really potentially get pretty far down the road in understanding what the picture is currently by using what's there. I do expect that it will be necessary to take some data out of the town database, some data out of the police databases, and put them together. But if that's feasible, then if there's a report generating mechanism, Crystal Reports or whatever it is, that will do that for us, that'd be very helpful.
Let me just get Kristen in here, and Bonnie, I see your hand too.
I definitely agree in principle with what you're saying, Mike. I think one of the things that I want to be mindful of is that it feels like now we're talking about things that are in this space between whether or not the data that we have describes the lived experiences within the community, and the degree to which the data does or does not describe the lived experiences is going to be an important thing for us, not necessarily to redirect all of our efforts into, but as folks who just had a meeting with Chief O'Leary regarding community engagement, transparency was among the things that was lifted up as being important. And so the degree to which the data is an accurate reflector of lived experience is going to be particularly important for us to get our heads around.
So I think we're actually in complete agreement. The lived experience is, how do you assemble what the lived experience is from a data perspective? You look at the calls that come in and the dispatches, and you compare that with, say, the field reports, and you get a large number of calls that have come in and a small number of situations in which an officer and the officer's supervisor felt like the stop was worthy of being put into the database that related to possible criminal activities. That leaves a very large field, a very large number of calls that came in where an officer was dispatched to do something where there was no criminal issue whatsoever. Okay. So if we then looked at the motor vehicle related calls or stops, if there was some way of doing that, then I appreciate that lived experience is partly what people feel and talk about, the stories that they talk about. That's very powerful, but there may be a way to get data to back it up. And that's what I'm after here.
I would say with the understanding that there are also going to be interactions that aren't captured in any of these data, as we're hearing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, there's there are police reports. If there were sort of resident reports about interactions with police, they might be very different, or might capture stops that aren't captured seemingly anywhere in our current data. Yeah.
That's the anecdote. That's the story part of it. That's so powerful that somebody doing something perfectly innocent, walking down the street, feels concerned because they're an African American person in what's perceived as a white neighborhood. If that, it's that kind of thing that we can't, that the data doesn't reflect at all. And it's very, very important to bring that together with the data if we possibly can. And what I'm exploring is, well, what's the data side of it? I absolutely agree that the lived part of it from the resident's perspective is extremely important.
And I said residents, and I also mean people, I don't know what term to capture this, community perspective maybe is better, folks passing through town also, who have interactions with the police department. They matter.
Yeah, the civilian side of it, if I can use that term.
Right.
Yeah.
Bonnie?
I want to make sure that we recognize that people are very interested in what is not recorded, and going through this line of questioning is very, very valid and important. And let's not stop it if people still have questions, because what we are finding out is that people's lived experience does not have proof within the police department. And that is key. Like if people are complaining about being stopped regularly for whatever reason, that is not recorded because their name is not taken, or it's said that it's not taken. I don't want to put doubt on anything, but there's a lot of possibilities here. And so this line of questioning is valid and essential. So I just want to stop the idea that this is not valid or useful in the discussion of this database.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there may be a way to match up that with the calls that come in, because a police officer is responding to a call, whether or not that then gets entered into a record about the stop, that a call came in, and that the call is reflective of the number of interactions that people have with the police department. And if it's possible to characterize the calls in some way, we get a sense of, well, how many times is an officer stopping somebody, having a conversation with them, and it doesn't turn into any kind of an incident. And yet that person has been stopped, they have been inconvenienced, they have worried a little bit about, well, what is this officer asking me these questions for? So it's a way of using the data to validate what people are telling us and what people feel in their minds. It's not a way of devaluing that at all. Quite the opposite.
What I'm pushing back on is your, what sounded like to me, you stopping the conversation. I want to make that clear. It's not about the data. All the data is.
No, I don't want to stop.
Anyway, I'm sorry. That's it.
Right. Yeah. No, hardly.
Alexander, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, just to the piece that you were just speaking about the possibility of matching up certain kinds of stops with calls.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of briefly speak to that. There may be some instances where that's possible. Certainly for a lot of the types of stops that we're talking about today, they have no connection to 911 calls or to non-emergency calls to the police necessarily, or in ways that would be almost impossible to track if you're not in the first place writing down whether these stops happen, right? We know that a lot of traffic stops, the reason that a lot of traffic stops are conducted by police is essentially in order to be able to have a look at the car to look for different criminal activity that has nothing to do with traffic, right? We know that people are being stopped on the street for a wide variety of reasons, some of which are not legitimate, some of which are, we're trying to make a reasonable suspicion stop here because we think it may be connected to something else we're investigating, which may or may not be connected to a 911 call, which may or may not be related to a 911 call on the same day. I'm not sure how productive that line of questioning it is, given the way that these stops come about. So it's a good idea. I think we're going to find that the data maps far beyond that.
So let's so a couple of things that are still on my mind as part of this conversation. One question I have is for the chief. You know, as far as you know, and I know things may have changed, but how is the department using any of these data to in officer assessment. So one example might be, let's think about that bad apple, for instance, right? And if there was, looking at this data, I could imagine either based on traffic stops or these field interrogations, let's say is the department looking out for potentially that one officer that seems to have a disproportionately high percentage of their stops be of residents of color or folks from the community of color. Is that something that the brass is looking at and following up with on a regular basis?
Yes, as far as a lot of that is centered around traffic stops.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's when you have more of a volume of people being stopped and recorded.
Right.
If a complaint comes into the Office of Professional Responsibility, there's about a person thinking that they got stopped based on their race. The investigator would then go and pull his or her traffic records to see the people that he issued or she issued the traffic tickets for, and to see if that was out of whack.
What about absent a complaint? Is that something that's regularly reviewed?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So what does that look like? I mean, just looking at the data, looking at the officers that are attached to these stops and cross-referencing that by race, where that's happening?
When I left, we had in place a system where, and I'm pretty sure it still continues, with a system where every 4 months, 3 or 4 months, the supervisor, each officer is assigned to a certain supervisor on their shift. So say for the patrol division, you have 24 officers and you have 3 sergeants. Well, each one of them got up to 8 people that they supervise. So within that 3 or 4 month period, there's a review done by that supervisor to go over the work activity, the sick leave, the management of time off, the stops that they make, and any other things that they're involved in. There's a one-on-one discussion that takes place and it's documented, and that's passed to the lieutenant and then goes up to the chain of command.
And if they're, if it's not looking good, if you say, wow, this seems to be, really out of whack for even outside of, what might be considered sort of a variance. Sorry about that. Is that sort of have a conversation with the officer, see how things go for the next 3 to 4 months, and then if things don't improve, take some other action, or what happens next?
If the supervisor is expected to document what he or she has done with that officer and what the expectations are. If no changes are made, then the option is to go into the early intervention system that we have. And that's where a person for up to 2 years is given a lot of extra supervision, extra training, and whatever it is, the reason why they're put into that. If he or she doesn't do good after that, then we have to look for another option that they probably shouldn't remain as a police officer. But yes, there are steps that get taken. And that's kind of what we've been doing for a long time now.
Great, thanks, you. The other just thought that's in my mind right now is there's been a lot said about the very low number of complaints that are filed with the police department. And I'm wondering, obviously to file a complaint, I think a pretty high barrier to filing a complaint, and I know some folks are looking into that on the reform side as well. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is the very more regular interactions that folks are having with in the community with police officers. I mean, I go to Starbucks and I get an email that says, "Hey, tell us about your experience with this barista," right? I don't know what that looks like here, but I'd like for us, whether that's in the departmental or whether that's in the engagement piece, for us to start thinking about what does it look like to get, I know Aton was working on a bit of this too, but I'd like to see what the engagement folks have to talk about, to say about this. But what does it look like to get a more regular feedback loop coming from the community? Literally, is it an officer being required to say, by the way, here's an email or here's a way, if you have any concerns about our interaction, you can actually, utilize this form, this email, this whatever, to share that with an independent body outside of the police department. And maybe that's something that's required of officers to actually hand out every time they stop someone, whether it be in traffic or otherwise. If you have any thoughts to share about this interaction or feedback about this interaction, you can do so here. I don't know if that's, that's just something that's come into my mind, but I think I'd love to see us tackle what that looks like, what that regular feedback loop looks like from the community, so that we're, we're not relying only on the very few formal complaints that are coming in. And there's a host of reasons why people wouldn't file formal complaints, even after having negative interactions. I've talked about this, a bit before, but outside of Brookline, I've had an officer put a gun to my head and did not file a complaint about it. And there's all kinds of reasons why I didn't do that, right? So there's really serious things that can happen and people don't file complaints. But I'm really interested in this, like, how do you feel about that stop? Was the officer respectful? Did they ask you to do anything that you felt was wrong or out of character? Those kinds of things, getting that kind of feedback. Does that make sense? We find some way to get at that. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
I just want to say one thing in response to Mike. I noticed when you were talking about someone being stopped and a report not being written, or there was no reason for the stop and the police officer moved on, that the person might feel inconvenienced. And I just want to push back on that a little bit, because I don't think it's necessarily a matter of inconvenience. I think it can be terrifying, especially if you're Black. And I don't want it to be pushed off that way, that it's just a matter of inconvenience. I think it's a much, much bigger concern, and I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
I used the term inconvenience, but I also mentioned specifically the feeling that an African American walking down the street in what is a largely white neighborhood feels concerned, uncomfortable, and we've heard exactly that kind of situation. I'm not trying to minimize anything. I know I'm the old white guy here, but I don't have old white guy attitudes, and that's why I'm here.
I'm just speaking about the language you used.
All right, folks. Also, I see Malcolm in the chat. I think this is an important point, Malcolm, about looking at the geography of stops too, and if there's a way to see if there's a prevalence of stops in certain areas of town versus others, that would be really helpful to know too. Does that make sense, Ron?
Pardon me, I was a little bit distracted there. Please repeat the question.
Oh, one of the things that Malcolm Cawthorn was bringing up is about the geography of stops and whether or not that information is, something that can be plotted and see if there is a prevalence in certain areas of town versus others.
I think that's an excellent question. At this particular point, I don't know to what degree that kind of detail may be recorded in the database. What would be interesting though about that is, I know that there's a proposal on the table for the body cam proposal that's on the table for the town. That proposal, I believe, includes putting in geographic information system information there. And once that is in place, you would definitely have information about time and place. But at this particular point, I don't know to what degree time and place. I would expect that something about time and place is recorded routinely in the database, but I don't have specific information about how that's recorded or in what kind of detail. Perhaps Chief O'Leary could clarify that.
If you're doing a stop, yeah, you would put down whereabouts the stop is being made. Was that the question?
Yeah, essentially, I think one of the things we'd like to see with the data is if we can tell if there are sort of a higher prevalence of stops in certain areas, particularly there's questions about, sort of in areas where public housing is present. That might be helpful.
You can tell where they stopped. It should be in the field interrogation form.
Okay. We'll have to see how we can make that work. Eitan?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to go back to one thing I just didn't quite understand. And this is a question for Chief O'Leary. If someone makes a call saying there is some suspicious activity, and they think it's some 20-something-year-old African-American male, do the police then consider it okay to just stop any 20-something-year-old Black male in that area? And if they have and then they can dismiss the concern and not record it if it's not it turns out to be not the person in mind, and there's no evidence of that. That's what we're talking about here?
No, what our officers do on a call like that is that first it starts with the dispatcher. If you get somebody that's calling up and said there's a suspicious man in the corner, they're expected to ask more information as to why that person's suspicious, what's going on. Then there's another level when the officer responds. If he doesn't or she doesn't feel that there's enough information, they can just sit there and watch and make their own observations. It may be that their suspicion is not going to get aroused based on the lack of information from the caller. They're not going to do anything, but that may change. We don't expect everybody's call that says there's a suspicious person without being able to back it up to result in a stop. The officer has the discretion to take a look at things and make his or her own mind up as well.
But what if the call was, they saw someone breaking and entering and then, running down Washington Street?
Well, if the person fits the description and he's running down Washington Street, yeah, I'd expect it to be stopped.
So if the description was like a 20-something-year-old white man walking down Washington Street, they would stop every 20-something-year-old white male?
No, what's he wearing? Does he have a hat? Does he have a backpack? Things like that. You'd have to try to get as much information as you can. But if you throw running into that and you're fully dressed and you're running down the street, well, I think they'd be remiss not to stop somebody like that. You're running away from a reported crime. In general, you fit the description. You're doing exactly what the person said you were doing. You're identified as a white guy in his 20s, and it takes 2 seconds to.
Yeah. Are you concerned? I mean, are you concerned that practice of figuring out what to do in that moment differs by racial group?
It shouldn't. It shouldn't. I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time training our officers, and I understand that our officers are all picked from the human race, but by the same token, we do tell them our expectations, and I think that the officers do try to live up to them. I mean, from an officer's perspective, we've heard more in more recent times that they're concerned about responding to calls with not enough information. And they want the information, and they want to know if they can stop there and not take enforcement activity or not make the stop if they're not comfortable with that. And we've told them, yes, you don't have to go ahead and do that. So, I know what everybody's driving at, but by the same token, you take a look at it from the officer's perspective. They asked for more information from the dispatcher. And you can hear some calls over the dispatcher. They say, well, I don't have enough. I'm not going to stop that guy. They'll come right out and say it. And that's the way it should be. I mean, we're trying to provide public safety. We're not trying to violate anybody's rights. And there's a balance there. Mistakes are made. Yes, they're made. We're human. Everybody makes mistakes. But I think the way to do it is the way that the police department is doing it, in a way that get as much information as you can from the caller, back it up with personal information, personal views. And if you don't do that, then it's up to the officer whether to decide to stop or not. A lot of officers will not stop. And I don't know of a time when the supervisor forced them to do that.
Thank you.
All right. I think this has been actually really eye-opening discussion, at least for me, and maybe others here too. So Ronald, thanks for all your work on this. Really appreciate it. Dan, thanks for your continued sort of input on all these issues. And Almas, thanks for bringing this to us. Ron, any last words, or how you plan to continue to follow up on this?
Nope. Just next, I'm going to be meeting with Sergeant Hatchett to get more information. One of the things I will have in mind are the questions that came up during this meeting, and I think I'll report back when I have more information, and I expect I'll have a lot more. So thanks everyone for listening and for bringing up your very pertinent questions.
Great, thank you. We'll see you soon. Work continues.
Take care. So should I drop off now, or?
I think you just got your answer. I believe you're back in the attendees. Hopefully, good. You're still there. Thanks, Ron. Okay, so continuing on with our agenda. Next up, we have our subcommittee updates. I'll note the time. It is 9:13. We will be done by 10 today. So these will be a bit more brief maybe than last week, but also, we covered a lot of ground last week, so maybe you don't have a ton to update us on, but let's see. The first group on the list is the Departmental Analysis. Eitan, would you like to lead that?
Sure. We had a very productive meeting yesterday. In 2 weeks or so, 2 weeks minus 1 day from now, we should have a working document in Google Docs with some on a couple of points regarding traffic stops, regarding how the police department gets new ideas and feedback, learns from external sources, both sort of a lit review, like here's what we know, what happened so far, and the beginnings of a few recommendations for future action. So I would say we're in pretty good shape. And then the survey, I know the surveys in this subcommittee, it also feels like it should, like the survey is, I guess, ongoing also. So we're going to start the survey next week. I think the initial, we kind of talked about the protocol for that. So I think initially what's going to happen is the survey data is going to start to trickle in. We'll get the bulk of it probably by the end of this month, the data. And I will start essentially programming code that can continually update graphs and things like that as new data comes in. But I think initially what's going to happen is I'm going to write a draft report from the survey data. But so that will be, yeah, so the timeline is before Thanksgiving, our subcommittee will have the beginnings of a document with background and recommendations that could eventually fold into a larger task force report upon feedback. And then, basically through December, we'll also be working on analyzing the survey.
Okay. And just the timeline wise, believe, and Devin, jump in here when I'm wrong. Sometime next week, maybe the middle of next week, perhaps, a press release will go out. I know that the Community Envisioning and Community Engagement Subcommittee worked on some language for that. Thank you for that. And that'll go out sort of saying, hey, members of the community, a survey will be hitting the inbox, the mailboxes of about 25,000 of you. We highly encourage you to participate in this, be forthcoming, share your experiences, etc. And then, is it right, Eitan, but we believe by the end of next week, that's when the surveys will start being mailed? Is that right?
Yeah, they're at the printer. Everything is lined up. So Schaffner told me that he said by the end of next week. So let's assume that it's Thursday or Friday of next week. That's the 12th, 13th. That will get into people's mailboxes on the 16th or so, the Monday. And usually I've done a couple of surveys similar to this. You get a mail and you're asked to take it online, and usually the bulk, like 80% or so of the responses come in within 2 weeks or so, and then there's a trickle after that. But we can start doing an analysis based on the bulk of stuff. So by the beginning of December, that we'll have a lot of our responses in by then.
All right, that's great news. Anything else to add from members of the committee itself? Yeah, I think Eitan covered a good deal of it. I'll just say on the we are looking at traffic enforcement and other communities like Berkeley that are moving traffic enforcement over to a civilian body, and Cambridge, which has proposed it. And I'll be talking to city councilors from both of those communities to learn a little bit more about what that process has been like, where they are right now, what kind of feedback they've gotten from the community, all of that kind of stuff. And we're also looking into some of the data, as Mike mentioned earlier, around traffic stops and additional action that's coming out of traffic stops. One of the key things is assuming there is some value to and that's a big assumption, by the way. It's not my assumption, but for the sake of this this work, let's assuming there's some value to instead of just giving someone a ticket for rolling through a stop sign, asking them for more information and doing investigatory work. Does that value sort of supersede some of the cost? And I don't mean the financial cost at all, but all the costs that we're talking about, the sort of some of the trauma that is connected to traffic stops and other negative aspects of the stop. So we're going to be digging into all that kind of stuff, but ultimately, because our work is around reimagining, I expect that we're going to be really looking at what would it look like if Brookline were to do something very different in regard to traffic stops that doesn't involve police engagement. So keep an eye out for that. All right, any questions here? The work continues. Next up, we have envisioning / community engagement.
Yeah, well, why don't I start, and then I'll call in the rest of the folks that were in the most recent meetings to help round out the update. We had what I thought was a very good discussion with Lieutenant Pastor, Officer Pilgrim, and Chief O'Leary yesterday. I would regard that as more of a setting the table or learning the landscape conversation that we were able to have. Among the things that came out of it that I'm currently sitting with, hearing, as I mentioned earlier, that the value that is placed by BPD on transparency and relationships felt affirming to hear, because it sounded like this is not a value that needs to be brought or injected into the conversation, that it's already present. And so it feels like that was among the things to help set the table for some of the work that may lie ahead. The second was hearing back that from Lieutenant Pastor and Chief O'Leary in particular, that the goals that around community engagement are hard to quantify. Relationships are the community regard when it comes to relationships have historically been hard for the department to quantify. And I think my takeaway on that is that creates space to engage the community on being able to provide some additional ways that there can be feedback on how we can come up with some ways to quantify. We did get a bit of homework that came out of this discussion to go back and take a look at some of the surveys that have been implemented in years prior, because they do have some important metrics for us to consider around the overall community regard. And I think there's going to be some important overlap with the survey that Eitan just mentioned, because the degree to which we have a representative community of folks in Brookline that has been surveyed previously with some of the metrics that Chief O'Leary mentioned, and what we have now, if we end up getting perspectives from different groups of people, that will be an important thing for us to keep in mind. And just the third was that we spent some time talking through the complaints process. Officer Pilgrim did walk us through the complaints process, and then there was some good discussion spearheaded by Chi-Chi around some ways that we may be able to improve how the process of giving feedback and process of the community providing input as you mentioned earlier, Raul, that there can be, for lots of reasons, a process of giving feedback and sharing experiences with police can be a high bar to surmount at times. And so that was a particularly important thing for us to get into. It felt like this was a starting point of a good conversation. Came away feeling like there's, especially on the heels of today, that today's conversation, that there will be a number of other important rounds for us to have. And I think the takeaway that I'm sitting with right now, based on yesterday's conversation, is largely the transparency and relationships portion of it, I think is particularly important. And then making sure that it's not just that we feel good about each other, but it's that the system is just. I think both of those things have to be true at the same time. And so can I call in the other subcommittee members for additional perspectives or differing on our subcommittee meeting?
Sure, Kristen. I'd like to go, and one of the things I wanted to note was about 2 hours after our conversation with Chief O'Leary on this particular topic, we had a meeting, subcommittee meeting of the Departmental Analysis subcommittee, and some of the work and thinking that we basically ATON's been doing about providing a structure for continuous feedback and input to the police department by the community. There was a lot of overlap, and one of the things that struck me about our initial conversation with Lieutenant Pastor and Officer Pilgrim is that a lot of the community engagement seemed to be broad but not deep. So things like social media, attending festivals, and being sort of out there provided a way of getting the police department's message out there, but not a regular structured way of getting input into the police department. And so one of the things that Departmental Analysis has been talking about is how do you create a structure for that so it's continuous and maybe even going beyond feedback and providing an advisory capacity to, do we want to even think about governance by a civilian body? And we, Raul talked about that's supposed to be the select board, but the select board only has so much bandwidth. And, does the select board want to delegate to a particular body that function? So so what struck me was there was a lot of overlap between the two subcommittees and some thinking that should be done on structures of how to make that engagement deep as well as broad.
Great. Any questions here?
If I could add one thing, and I just want to preface, I had to leave early, so I was only there for about 35 minutes. But one of the things that came through kind of in conjunction with what Christian and Chichi are saying in relation to today's meeting, it's not, I think part of the reimagining is also how, our public safety comes to assessing needs of communities and what those needs are. And so, I think of Brookline as a very fluid place. Lots of people live here, get their kids through school and then leave.
Yes.
Or if they're going to school here, they live here for a little bit,
It's like a huge
go to undergrad, grad school, then leave. Like, it's a pretty fluid place. So that means our population and community needs change, a lot compared to, I would say, even a place like Newton. And so how do you assess the community needs? And I think that goes to something Chichi just said. It's easier to go broad that way than it is to go deep, right? And it's also easier to think about things in that way. So I think like one of our reimagining is to come up with some type of form where
That'd be great.
we're helping with assessment to address needs. The question I left the meeting with was, in the late 80s and 90s, we had a huge surge of Russian-speaking immigrants coming at the end of the Cold War. Well, that's not true anymore, right? So while we would have needed that as a community and part of public safety for a generation of Brookline, like that doesn't fit our community in the same way now. And so how do we adjust and do that and assess? That's something I think part of our reimagining is going to have to incorporate.
You know, one other thing I'd like to say is, you know, for all of the different subcommittees, we need, it's going to be critical for us to get feedback from the public on anything that we even are considering recommending to any other bodies later on. So start thinking in your subcommittees about what that looks like, and you know, if you wanted to do a you know, sort of public hearing or something like that, when you'd like to see something like that happen, and we're going to look for, of course, the this subcommittee on envisioning community engagement to help lead that work. Bonnie.
Off of your point, so we're working on some events in the near future. We attempted to, well, we tried to investigate if it were possible to do a public event on BHA grounds, and things like that. And it's complicated, and we're working on that. So we have a Zoom event probably coming up very soon, and there's still this possibility of a public event to go to in person. But also I wonder, and we haven't been able to talk about this in depth in our subcommittee meetings, but how, if another subcommittee wants to do public engagement, is that something that we handle? Do we oversee, or do we participate in that community engagement? Like, are we as the team deciding how this works or leading it?
You know, that's something that I think we should talk about in this space here. And, you know, it might be different for different bodies. So for instance, for the group that is working on issues related to school resource officer, I think if we do something, we should also be partnering with the school committee on that. And maybe that's a joint public hearing kind of thing or something. I don't know, but you know, I think it might be different based on the different work that's happening in the subcommittees, but we certainly need to talk about it here, and then you know, guide us. This is you know, have the subcommittee on envisioning and community engagement guide, you know, what might be the best way to go about getting the feedback that we're looking for.
I think also in terms of the language that we use, I wonder if there's a need to all come together on some language that is public language that we use when we talk about the work that we're doing as a task force, so that we're all on the same page, communicating the same thing. And additionally to that, we are now, and this overlaps with the Walk and Talk subcommittee work that I'm going to talk about in a minute. There's work going out from the reform committee. There's a survey that's going out in a series of interviews for Walk and Talk. And our group wants to do not a survey, but some interviews, because gathering information is super important. The difference between the two, reform and reimagine, is similar, but very different also. So as we are reaching out to the community, it's going to get real confusing, because they're going to be getting messages from two different directions about the same thing. I don't know what the answer is, if there's some way between the reform and reimagine committees that needs to agree on how to address that, because I think if we just go forth as we are, it's going to get muddy. And it's hard for me to think about. So if anyone has thoughts or opinions about that, maybe it's not as important as I'm making it in my head, but this is something that concerns me, the communication of the goals of each of these things. And why is there so many people coming at BHA to talk about Walk and Talk or something like that?
I mean, I understand sort of the walk and talk. Our walk and talk group is in conversation with the walk and talk group on the reform committee, and I think that's appropriate and very helpful to make sure that we're coordinating efforts as best as possible, while also understanding that we may have different ultimate objectives
Right.
in terms of the type of information we're trying to collect
Mhm.
and how we're going to use that information. So I think
Right.
the best thing we can do is just keep in contact with each other.
Yeah. Yep. I think there's an element coming from the reform that we are somehow not communicating, and that there's two twin efforts happening, but we definitely have questions that are very different from the reform committee. So if there's some way that we can coordinate that or something, yeah.
Right. I do want to recognize it's 9:33, and we have 3 more of the subcommittees to hear from. So let's, Bonnie, maybe you and I can talk more offline about that, about just the communication between the two bodies, and see if there's anything more we can do. Okay. All right. So the next one is the SRO, School Resource Officers Subcommittee. Anything to report there? Someone?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We have not met since our last meeting. So there's nothing very new, but Raul came across, and I'll just share, there's a similar conversation within the actual schools about school resource officers. And so I can only speak through the high school as opposed to the full district. But there was a survey that went to MECO families, African-American Latino scholars families, and Steps to Success families, in particular around the placement of the school resource officer at Brookline High School. And since I am MECO coordinator and we'll get that data, I will happily share with this task force as well as with the committee. We are starting to get information. I've only checked the number of responses, and so I'm not fully sure. And one of the things that we have to be careful about is there's a lot of overlap, so to speak. So one of the things, at least since I've been there, I can't speak to before, we've always promised to own each other's kids, that they're all ours. And so I have kids from Steps who spend all their time in the MECO space pre-COVID and vice versa. And by definition, African-American Latino scholars is anybody who fits that racial identity. So those are MECO kids who are in scholars as well as Steps kids who are in scholars. And so there is a little bit of overlap, but we're hoping to call that data, and that's hoping to build into a conversation with adults and kids. We have not quite figured out whether that will be separate or not. And certainly, again, we can share, piggyback, or any of that other stuff with that.
Can I just ask, my family would be part of that group that you're surveying. Did those surveys, did that go out already? Because we haven't.
So I have sent it to my MECO families. I know it was sent to Steps families. I am not so certain if scholars have sent theirs out. They purposely were going to go later to sort of say, hey, you may have already got this. If you did, you don't have to fill it out again. So yeah, we try to meet once a week, and we couldn't this week because of the election day off and a screwy schedule. So I have not followed up with Miss Hunt, who oversees the scholars program, but she was purposely going a little bit later than Steps and MECO.
Okay, thank you.
Because of that overlap.
Great. All right. We'll look to for a report back on that either next week or the following week, whenever you have the responses in. Okay. If there's nothing else here, I'd like to move on. Hearing none, to vulnerable people and people in crisis.
Hi. So we met yesterday with some folks from the Brookline Center for Mental Health. Met with Ian Lang, the CEO, Heather Likas, or Likas, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, it's with a Y, and Megan Smith, who worked there, and we spoke a lot about their relationship with police and how they work around responses to mental health crisis responses, and also what they do and what they would like to do in order to provide mental health support prior to and hopefully preventing mental health crisis. It was a really productive conversation. I, as usual, took way too detailed notes, so those will be up soon if anyone wants to see more or less everything that happened. The things I think that were really particularly productive was what they were talking about of you need to spend a lot of time developing relationships with people in the community so that when they need help, they'll feel comfortable talking to you, coming and talking to you. But that's not the kind of bright, shiny object that people like to fund. They would like to be able to put more people out into the community to go beyond their building so that they could have something like outreach teams. And they, looking a little bit more at some of the other things that they said they would like, they also said they would love to be able to offer like same-day crisis therapy or counseling appointments that would just be available with a phone call. One thing I want to make sure that I mention, and I want to, they would also love to have a peer-to-peer support system. A number of them have worked in programs that have that type of system, and they wish that's something they had now. Something they're about to start that's very exciting is what's called a case management program. And I was like, what's that? Which is essentially setting up two new dedicated staff members that they're in the hiring process for now, who are going to be helping folks work through, like connecting them to systemic resources. Like,
Get Alexander back.
Benefits, and those type of systems are incredibly difficult to navigate, and the lack of access to that type of really important like daily systems has an enormous effect on mental health. That like no amount of counseling is going to fix the fact that your housing is unstable, right? And so that's something they're getting into now, which is very exciting. So we learned a lot, and we're gonna continue the work.
Alexander, just so you know, we lost you for about 5 to 7 seconds there, but I think we got it though.
Basically, what Alexander was saying is that the center acknowledged that aside from one-to-one individual counseling, that there are a tremendous amount of factors that go into how somebody's doing in terms of their mental health, in terms of how they're doing in the community, and that we need to figure out ways of addressing that holistic picture, which is a different kind of service sometimes than just one-on-one counseling, how to meet people in the community and support people who may not have housing or may be in jeopardy of losing their housing, or food insecurity and all those things. So it was a great conversation. We really learned a lot from them, and I think they appreciated being brought in, and we'll probably be following up with them later, maybe in just some one-to-one kind of conversations. We've realized that we've had some really productive interviews over the last couple of weeks with the CIT team, Annabelle and Jen Pastor from BPD, and then with the Brookline Center. So we feel like we've gathered a lot of information from kind of major stakeholders in terms of the scope of our work. And now we need some time to kind of digest what we've learned, write our report, preliminary report, and then kind of work on our next steps in terms of what we're hoping to do with our subcommittee going forward.
Terrific. Any questions here? And walk and talk unit, you are up next. Subcommittee.
Okay. So as I was saying earlier, we are looking at, we got a copy of the Walk and Talk Reform Committee survey and their cover letter just yesterday, I believe. And so we fully intend to use that information because we're not going to put out another survey. Raul, you worked really hard in the select board to make sure that you know, you preserved the vision of this Reimagine committee and didn't include an officer, the voting member. This survey and this cover letter is very much coming, it seems to be very clearly coming from that space. Like it's not directly coming from the Brookline Police Department, but there's, you know, the language of it is very different than the language that we would use. There's you know, nothing wrong with their language, but so getting back to my very tangled worry about getting this walk and talk thing out here to get the information that we need in collaboration, that's also an issue. There's a cover letter. It includes photos of the police officers that are currently the walk and talk officers. And I worry that results may be skewed because it might put people off that might respond otherwise, because it feels like it's coming from the walk and talk program. So there's that. That's a challenge we have to overcome. We intend to do some interviews. They are also doing interviews. So we have to find our way to be able to separate the two committees and find people to give us information, because our priorities are information from the police department about their goals and information from the people receiving the service of walk and talk, and if those goals are being met and how else those goals might be met if they are not being met. So that is a big challenge right now that we're thinking about. We are developing content and designing a flyer to be distributed for these interviews. We are brainstorming strategies about how that will be distributed. We are considering a separate Gmail account to be able to collect anonymous information, or to add a way that people could engage with us in that way, that the three of us on the committee would have access to. We also are prioritizing BHA residents over walk and talk stakeholders, not to lose the walk and talk stakeholders, but because the work, it's going to be a lot easier to get BHA administration and officers to speak with us than it is to get the residents to speak with us. So our priority right now is to push as hard as we can to find a way to get that information. And then we will work on the BHA and walk and talk officer information. And also I wanted to ask a question. If we're printing flyers, can we spend money on that? Or how much can we spend, or how do we deal with the budget?
The answer is, I'm sure yes, and that Devin might be able to help us out with how we go about doing that.
Yes, so I think maybe to Bonnie's point about process, if your subcommittee had a formal recommendation, you know, we've cost out that we'd like to do this, it will cost this much, this is the vendor that we're going through. You would bring that then to the larger task force. I imagine it would be voted on, and then obviously we would get those funds taken care of for you guys. I don't know, Raul, if that's the way that you want to move forward, or if you want to say, you know, each subcommittee has X amount of money to do with what they'd like, depending on how you want to run that process. But yeah, whatever.
No, I mean, yeah, I would just say, just communicate with me about that directly. Let's not over process this, but something like, are you talking about like 50 flyers or 5,000 flyers?
Not 50. 50 will not be enough. Maybe
100?
Maybe 250.
Okay. I guess my question would be, is that something that we have the capacity as the town to do in-house without having to go to a printer, or?
Yeah, I mean, if this is Devin, if you folks put together a flyer and then send it to me, we can print it at the town hall, and then someone could just pick them up for distribution.
Okay. Is that color or black and white?
We can do color.
Great.
Excellent.
And I want to add to what Bonnie's saying about the two subcommittees in police reform and reimagining. My concern is around the interviews of BHA residents, that it could be extremely confusing for BHA residents to be able to differentiate between the charges of the two subcommittees, and could be just a very confusing process. And I don't think that the reform committee subcommittee is prioritizing interviews. And it's something that we can maybe just work together offline about, but they are doing the survey, and then at the end of their survey, they say, if you're interested in speaking further, please contact, I think, Caitlin at in Brookline. But that could be conceivably a concern, because we're prioritizing interviews. We're not doing a survey, they're doing the survey. Just how to make that work so that it's not confusing for residents.
Okay. Can I ask a separate question? Have we yet heard the perspective of BHA leadership on this? I'm wondering, the relatively new executive director, the board of the BHA, if we have already, but if not, when we're going to hear from them on this. I'm wondering, are they fully supportive of this program? Are they also asking some of the same questions that we are about this, and maybe are they interested in reassessing? Are they part of this this fact-finding process? Where are they in all this?
Well, as I mentioned before, our priority is the large amount of work we have to get interviews from the BHA people. I mean, I'm sorry, the residents, because that's a lot more difficult than reaching out to the admin. It's definitely something that we can do in conjunction, but as far as the lion's share of time spent right now is pushing to figure out this knot of communications. But that's certainly on the docket, and yes, we are. It's on our priority list. It's just a little bit below what we're doing right now.
Great. All right, that's terrific. Yeah, I mean, they could be very excited partners in this work, is the reason I bring it up, or they could be resistant to addressing these, because I literally don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to anybody there about it, but I sooner than later, I think it'd be great to have a conversation with the BHA director and perhaps the board about this too.
Will absolutely happen.
Great. Other questions? All right. Well, I do believe we have covered the update on the policing survey. The survey. Is there any other new business? This is also an opportunity if someone wants to get something on the agenda for next week that you'd like us to discuss further or delve more deeper into. This would be a good opportunity to say that as well.
So I do want to revisit just quickly the piece that we were talking about earlier in terms of FIO stops. I I guess, I mean, like, without getting like too deeply into like Terry v. Ohio and kind of the reasons why I was asking the questions that I was asking. So I do just want to kind of briefly explain, so in case folks are confused about my line of questioning. So if an officer thinks they have reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop, that just means you have reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop, right? It doesn't mean anything else about whether, you know, the officer is going to later turn out to be correct or not. So the fact that we now know that if an officer has reasonable suspicion for a stop, executes a stop, and then turns out to be incorrect that this person is related to any kind of criminal activity, that stop is not recorded in any way. I completely agree with what Rahul is saying, is that that person's like name and identity don't need to be splashed around or on FIO lists in necessarily the same way. But the fact that those stops are not being recorded is frankly is pretty astonishing to me, because in my experience, that's the ball game for us if we're thinking about street stops. That's going to be most of the time. So I just wanted to flag that for folks, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
If I could just clarify maybe a statement that I made when said they're not recorded. There are times when the officer that's on the call will call out, I'm out at Beacon in Washington with the subject. And that's usually recorded. That's probably the extent of the stop if that person is ruled out. But a lot of times the dispatcher will record it, and it'd be in the CAD call or in the recording of the radio transmission at the same time. It's just that there's not much more information than that.
I hear you, and it's good to know that, you know, the fact that a stop happened existed in records somewhere, but that's not centralized in the same way that the FIO list is, right? You'd have to manually dig through the radio and dispatch records in order to do that. And I'm sure, you know, we could find a PhD student who's willing to sit down and drag through records like that, but it's not centralized in the same way.
That's right.
Thank you for that.
I mean, at a very minimum, and I say at a very minimum, you know, a footnote in those existing reports that would say, you know, not included in these data are stops where, you know, the reason for the stop was completely unfounded, and the person was just allowed to go on their way without collecting information at a very minimum. But I think you know, at least what I'm thinking is that we should include the number of those stops and whatever data, particularly around race and gender, we can reasonably be expected to include as part of that. We just have to make sure that we keep track of this. This feels more reformy than reimagining of course. So for all of those members and the chair of the reform committee that are listening to this, I hope you're taking note of this as well. But it's something that I'm putting a note in about, so that we can make sure that we get this addressed and figure out maybe what the right way to do this is. The other piece that I wanted to bring up that sort of that I hope will flesh out more, and maybe as we start to engage more and more with members of the community around envisioning reimagining, is what Eitan was talking about as part of the Departmental Analysis Subcommittee, is what does more sort of resident engagement look like in police oversight. You know, I do think that this is an area that is so important that it, you know, it seems to me that the select board does not have the bandwidth to provide the more regular oversight that's necessary over the police department to do that and everything else that the board is responsible for. And that we talked about this in our department meeting, in our subcommittee meeting. There are some things, for instance, I mean, I don't think that any member of the select board was aware about the fact that during that peaceful protest back in the spring or summer that Norfolk County Sheriff's Office, I don't know, deputies or whatever they're called, were going to be part of a response to that, and weren't engaged in that conversation, weren't involved in that conversation, and you see from the response afterwards from myself and other members of the board, frankly, being very concerned about that being part of the response. And so there seems to be some gap between those of us who are elected to lead and decisions like that being made that needs to get addressed in some way. And with that, so certainly, I'd be interested in looking at something like the role of someone, as I'm thinking about all these conversations, something like a public advocate, someone that is that does provide regular oversight, but also is that person. Let's say we do get those sort of comment cards going, or whatever that looks like. Hey, if you have any concerns about this stop or anything else, you can contact this independent, body that you can sort of lodge any complaints or concerns to, and what that all looks like. We need to dig deeper into that. I think a lot of folks are expecting the select board to play that role, and I think there's some really good reasons why the select board is not in a particularly good position to do that. And so I think we'll talk more about that. Anything else? 9:59. Anything else? Y'all, I'll just say thank you. I know I've said it before. I'll say it again. You're doing tremendous work. Keep at it. I know the more you dig into this, the more it seems that is there that needs to be addressed. Keep at it, and most importantly, let us know what support you need. I'm certainly available in between all these meetings, and I'll try to attend more and more of the subcommittee meetings as I'm available, just to listen in. But please reach out, let me know, and of course, always let Devin know what kind of support you need. Sounds good? All right, y'all. See you back here next Friday, if not sooner. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.